Hi, boys and girls. I wanted to follow up reading and finishing chapter 1 of Indian in the Cupboard. I decided to come out in my backyard where I'm safe for some fresh air and read to you guys. So I figured something out. It was real interesting as I was reading the story. I mentioned that he turned the key, but it wouldn't open. I had forgotten it wasn't that the door was stuck. It is that he locked it. He used the key and he locked it. That's why it wouldn't open. So I just wanted to review real quick. The main character is Omri. His friend is Patrick. And he had his brother Gillen that had given him the gift. So I'm going to go ahead and start from where we left off, where he told his mom he found a key. "Have you, darling? Which one?" His mother came to look. "Oh, that one. How very odd. That was the key to my grandmother's jewelry box that she got from Florence. It was made of red leather and it fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and gave it to me. She was mostly terribly poor when she died, poor old sweetie, and kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end I said I'd rather have this little key than all the jewels in the world. I threaded it on that bit of ribbon, it was much longer then, and hung it around my neck and told her I'd always wear it and remember her. And I did so for a long time, but then the ribbon broke and I nearly lost it." "You could have got a chain for it," said Omri. She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I should have done just that, but I didn't. And now it's your cupboard key. Please don't lose it, Omri, will you?" Omri put the cupboard on his bedside table and, opening it, looked inside thoughtfully. "What would he put in it?" "It's supposed to be for medicine," said Gillen. "You should keep your nose drops in it." "No, that's just wasting it. Besides, I haven't any other medicines." "Why don't you pop this in?" his mother suggested, and opened her hand. It was Patrick's Indian. "I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine." If you haven't heard that word before, trousers is another word for pants. Omri carefully stood the Indian on the shelf. "Are you going to shut the door?" asked his mother. "Yes, and lock it." He did this and then kissed his mother, and she turned the light out and he lay down on his side looking at the cupboard. He felt very content. He was just dropping off to sleep when his eyes snapped open. He thought he had heard a little noise, but no, all was quiet. He closed his eyes again. In the morning, there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him. He lay perfectly still in the dawn light, staring at the cupboard, from which was now coming the most extraordinary series of sounds. A patterning, a tapping, a scrambling, and surely a high-pitched noise like, well, almost like a tiny voice. To be truthful, Omri was petrified. Petrified's a word you use sometimes to say you were scared stiff. Who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly, there was something alive in that cupboard, and at last he put out his hand and touched it. He pulled very carefully. The door was shut tight, but as he pulled, the cupboard moved just slightly. The noise from inside instantly stopped. He lay for a long time wondering. He imagined it. Or had he imagined it? The noise did not start again. At last he cautiously turned the key and opened the cupboard door. The Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed and peered into the dark corners. Suddenly he saw him, but he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was in the bottom of the cupboard, and he wasn't standing upright. He was crouching in the darkest corner, half hidden by the front of the cupboard, and he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though, the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still as Omri had kept lying in bed a moment ago. He was breathing heavily. His bare bronze shoulders rose and fell and were shiny with sweat. The single feather sticking out of the back of the headband quivered as if the Indian were trembling, and as Omri peered closer and his breath fell on the tiny huddled figure, he saw it jump to its feet. Its minute hand had a sudden darting movement with its belt and came to a rest, clutching the handle of a knife smaller than the shaft of attack. I'm going to have to stop for a minute. I don't know. I've got a helicopter coming over. Real noisy. Let's see if you guys can hear me. I'm going to talk right into the microphone. Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps half a minute. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other. The Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back from shining white teeth. Sorry, he's doing circles up there now. His lips were drawn back from shining white teeth, so small you could scarcely see them, except when they caught the light. He stood pressed against the inside wall of the cupboard, clutching his knife, rigid with terror but defiant. The first coherent thought that came into Omri's mind as he began to get over the shock was, "I must call the others," meaning his parents and brothers, but something, he wasn't sure what, stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian for even a moment he would vanish, or become plastic again, and then when the others came running they would all laugh and accuse Omri of making things up, and who could blame anyone for not believing this unless they saw it with their own eyes? Another reason Omri didn't call anyone was that, if he was not dreaming and the Indian had really come alive, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that had ever happened to Omri in his life, and he wanted to keep it to himself at least at first. His next thought was that he must somehow get the Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him any further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard. The Indian gave a fantastic leap into the air. His black hair flew, and the fringes of his leggings fluttered. His knife, raised above his head, flashed. He gave a shout which, even though it was a tiny shout to match his body, was nevertheless loud enough to make Omri jump. But not so much as he jumped when the little knife pierced his finger deeply enough to draw a drop of blood. Omri stuck his finger into his mouth and sucked it, and thought how gigantic he must look to the tiny Indian, and how fantastically brave he had been to stab him. The Indian stood there, his feet in moccasins planted apart the white-painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held ready, and his black eyes quiet, wild. Omri thought he was magnificent. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I only want to pick you up." The Indian opened his mouth, and streams of words spoken in that loud, tiny voice came out, not one of which Omri could understand. "Don't you speak English?" asked Omri. All the Indians in films spoke a sort of English. It would be terrible if his Indian couldn't. How would they talk to each other? The Indian lowered his knife a fraction. "I speak," he grunted. Omri breathed deeply in relief. "Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it happened that you came to life, but it must be something to do with this cupboard, or perhaps the key. Anyway, here you are, and I think you're great, and I don't mind that you stabbed me. Only please can I pick you up? After all, you are my Indian," he finished in a very reasonable tone. He said all this very quickly while the Indian stared at him. The knife point went down a little further, but he didn't answer. "Well, can I? Say something," urged Omri impatiently. "I speak slowly," grunted the miniature Indian at last. "Oh," Omri thought, and then he said very slowly, "Let me pick you up." The knife came again in an instant, and the Indian's knees bent into a crouch. "No." "Oh, please." "You touch, I kill," the Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat from a tiny creature scarcely bigger than his finger, armed only with a pinpoint. But Omri didn't laugh. He didn't even feel like laughing. This Indian, his Indian, was behaving in every way like a real live Indian brave, and despite the vast difference in their sizes and strengths, Omri respected him and even, odd as it sounded, feared him at that moment. "Oh, okay, I won't then, but there's no need to get angry. I won't hurt you." Then, as the Indian looked baffled, he said in what he supposed was Indian English, "Me no hurt you." "You come near, I hurt you," said the Indian swiftly. Omri had been half lying in bed all this time. Now, cautiously and slowly, he got up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He couldn't be sure why he was being cautious. Was it so as not to frighten the Indian, or because he frightened himself? He wished one of his brothers would come in, or better still, his father, but no one came in. Standing in his bare feet, he took the cupboard by its top corners and turned it till it faced the window. He did this very carefully, but nevertheless the Indian was jolted, and having nothing to hold on to, he fell down. But he was on his feet again in a second, and he had not let go of his knife. "Sorry," said Omri. The Indian responded with a noise like a snarl. There was no more conversation for the next few minutes. Omri looked at the Indian in the early sunlight, and it was a splendid sight. He was just under 3 inches tall. His blue-black hair, done with a plait and pressed into his head by a colored headband, gleamed in the sun. So did the minuscule muscles of his tiny torso and the skin of his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings, which had some decoration on them too small to see properly. He wore a kind of a bandolier across his chest, and his belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Best of all, somehow, were his moccasins. Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where his magnifying glass was. It was the only way he would ever be able to see and appreciate the intricate details of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked as closely as he dared at the Indian's face. He expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. The turkey feather that had been stuck in the headband had come out when the Indian fell and was now lying on the floor of the cupboard. It was about as big as the spike on a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. Omri asked suddenly, "Were you always this small?" "I'm not small, you big," the Indian shouted angrily. "No," began Omri, but then he stopped. He heard his mother beginning to move about next door. The Indian heard it too. He froze. The door of the next room opened. Omri knew that at any moment his mother could come in and wake him for school. In a flash, he had bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And he closed and locked the cupboard and jumped back into bed. "Come on, Omri, time to get up." She bent down and kissed him, paying no attention to the cupboard, and went out again, leaving the door wide open. Well, that's the end of chapter 1. And I get a little challenge for you here. They mentioned something about a spike on a horse chestnut. A little project for you to do a little bit later. I want you to see if you can look up and see what a horse chestnut is, because that's what I'm going to do. And then we can kind of discuss it tomorrow before I read a little bit. Guys, stay safe. Make sure you're listening to your mom and dad. We'll talk to you soon.